So we work directly with Pond, and I know firsthand how impacted everybody was by the pandemic. And so they can really use this money. It will go towards the programming that Kathy spoke of. It's valuable stuff for our community, especially for getting these young kids involved in sports in early age. It helps us as an association keep the costs down for those things so people aren't turned off by the costs and they're more concerned about getting their kids involved in athletics and sports. Thanks.
And I agree. My kids were involved in the international games a couple of different years, and I've been out there to watch the younger kids play, and it's really a goodwill between a couple of different countries. So I wholeheartedly support it as well. Mr. Kramer, would you like to make any comments?
All right, now you can probably hear me, right?
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah, 2020 was a very tough year for Pond, as it was for the whole entire St. Louis West. And Dan, thank you for those comments, and everybody else, thank you. We are proceeding with the international games as scheduled, first week of August. So right now, all those teams from abroad are planning on coming into our community, which does help our community in a big way. As Dan said, it really helps these kids get out of the house and play ball, and we appreciate everything the city can do for us. Registration was down due to the pandemic, and we're still dealing with refunds from last year. So unfortunately, we did take a big hit on registration of about $20,000 that we had to use a line of credit to help with. And a lot of families opted to get the refunds because they didn't know what 2021 would bring them. We did offer coupon codes in lieu of refunds, and about 70% of people, teams, players did take the credit for that. So registration is questionable this year. I think everybody's waiting to see what the county restrictions are going to be, if we're going to be able to play ball and what's going to happen. But right now we're planning as we are playing ball. So thank you everybody for your support. It's much appreciated, and it's good to see all of you. So
thank you, Mr. Kramer.
Thank you.
So we have a motion and a second on the floor. All those in support of the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstained? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Our second item of business is the Parks and Stormwater Sales Tax Initiative, all wards. Who's going to address that? Mr. Vunich?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and members of the committee, before the department presents a brief description of the memorandum to the committee members, I would like to preface that presentation with a couple of remarks. First and foremost, the memorandum isn't being driven by the Department of Planning and Parks. I certainly don't want you all to think that the department's trying to butter its bread on both sides. The department in this case is just relaying this information to the Planning and Parks Committee because it has been discussed and actions have been taken by resident committees that have been formed by City Council for certain specific tasks. Secondly, it's a difficult issue. Anytime a tax is proposed, it certainly does create potential problems relative to how we spend our money, are we good stewards of our money, and what people think we're going to do with the money. And so I recognize that, but I think it is important to kind of start discussing it because again, in one instance, we've now been waiting almost 3 years since the Parks Action Plan Update Committee completed its task, and the Watershed Erosion Task Force took action back at the end of 2020. So those are my kind of preface comments, and thank you. In the memorandum, the department tries to provide to the committee members the background that leads us to this point of conversation. I note in 2006, when the original Citizens Committee developed the action plan for Parks and Recreation, it identified the need to impose or request a Parks and Stormwater sales tax for the city of Wildwood. In 2008, that tax was presented to the voters of Wildwood. And as you can see from the memorandum, it was a large vote. Almost 20,000 residents voted on the question, and 10,000 of them, more than 10,000 of them voted against it. It failed. And since that time, there has not been an initiative to proceed forward. Now, fast forward to the timeframe of 2015. Now, another Citizens Committee has been charged by City Council to update the Parks and Recreation Action Plan. And as that process went through discussion, those members identified almost immediately that funding source, a dedicated funding source, was essential to maintaining our world-class facilities. And then in the future, if approved by City Council, adding on to the network of trails and parks. The committee in 2016, with the adoption of that plan, recommended that the City Council proceed with placing the sales tax proposal on the ballot. There was debate on whether it should be done immediately or at some point in the future, but for the most part, the sales tax discussion didn't proceed forward and kind of languished for a bit. Now to the present. The Watershed Erosion Task Force was formed in 2019. That group, a large group of council members and citizen representatives, almost immediately identified that there are a number of problems in many of the watersheds. These problems affect public infrastructure and private property. And what ultimately the task force charged a group to do is to find funding sources. And I can assure you, Mr. Sturman, who is on that task force, did a yeoman's work trying to find anybody or anyone that might be able to fund stormwater erosion projects for the city of Wildwood. We started with the usual suspects, so to speak, the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, and then went far afield. At the end of that process, which was months in the making, it became clear that the most obvious resource, and maybe the best resource, was again the Parks and Stormwater sales tax. And so before the close of 2020, that task force voted to proceed forward with placing that question before the voters. Now, their action was contingent, obviously, on it being adopted and accepted by the City Council. The task force recommended a half-cent sales tax be assessed. That's the maximum amount. That no sunset be placed on the tax. This type of tax can have a 10-year limit, a 15-year limit, etc. But they recommended none. And then finally, as part of their action, they wanted it to be presented to the Wildwood voters in 2021. The rationale for the time frame is just the risk associated with some of the problem areas that have been identified and the impacts it can have on public safety. So tonight, the department isn't necessarily seeking an action from the committee. It is seeking input from the committee on how it would like to proceed. And certainly the department can then relay that information to the Watershed Erosion Task Force and others that have contemplated this tax. I'll conclude the presentation by just showing you one graphic, if Kathy would share screen at this time. Recently, the city of Creve Coeur, and that's the area in the center of the St. Louis region map that is in red, undertook this exact same initiative. And they were successful in the November elections at passing the Parks and Stormwater sales tax. So all the blue areas are communities that have the tax imposed in their boundaries and collect from sales within their boundaries that tax. As you can see, there is an obvious red area that I think we're all familiar with. The graphic kind of illustrates, I think, better than any words, that this tax is universally applied across the St. Louis region. And so if you shop anywhere now, other than a couple of municipalities in North County and South County, you are paying for that community's park and stormwater projects. And the thought is that we should be collecting money here from those that buy in Wildwood, whether residents or non-residents, so that we can benefit from it as well. So with that, Madam Chair, I'll conclude. And there are members of the Watershed Erosion Task Force on the committee, and certainly they can add to what I've provided to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So our screen was minimized, so I don't know who raised their hand first, but on the list I have Don, Rob, and Joe. So Don, would you like to go first?
I know Rob was up before I was.
Okay.
So Rob can go.
Rob?
Thank you, Don. Appreciate that. I won't be long. I just want to say that the best thing about living in St. Louis, I get choked up even talking about it, is the fact that I have paid $60 to go to another city's zoo, and we just say welcome. It's a heartwarming thing to be able to, entertain out of town guests and say, no, we don't have to pay for our zoo. We don't have to pay for our art museum, et cetera. And because that's supported by taxes. So to me, a half cent is a bargain. When we started talking about this in the WETF, I looked at surrounding communities, and I don't have the document in front of me. I captured it somewhere and then lost it. But every community around us pays up to I think it's up to 2.5 cents for city taxes, and a lot of those go to parks, I presume. I wasn't here at the time we asked the citizens last time, but I have to believe that it was our collective failure to evangelize the benefits of this tax, and that's why it must have failed, because the core value of Wildwood is the parks and the open spaces and the trees, and people are constantly, talking it up. And those same folks, if approached properly, I think would be happy to pay this half-cent sales tax. The problem is with this, the problem with the concept, as I see it, is the WETF needs. Ken Remy has given an estimate of up to $30 million just to fix, kind of hit the high spots. That's more money than this city can afford. And I'm afraid if it's combined too completely and diffused through the half-cent sales tax, we're not going to get any money for parks anyway, because it's all going to go to fix Hawks Creek or just whatever. And so my suggestion is that we talk about ways to separate or segregate those funds, or if we're going to consider an additional half-cent later that's targeted at erosion when the WETF gets its act together and figures out the costs or something like that, because I would happily pay the sales tax just for the parks, but lumping it together is a little scary to me. That's all I had to say.
Thank you, Rob. Don?
Thank you, Deborah. So I agree with a lot of what Rob said, and I'll start by saying that we definitely need some money. I mean, Joe and his team are continuously asked to do more, not with this, but to do more with less. And it's getting to be a lot more, and they're benefiting from it. So couple questions, and this is going to be for some people who, on the committee who may not know these, but for some residents that are participating also. Joe, if this sales tax measure is placed on the ballot, how active can the city be promoting or advocating for the tax increase?
The city cannot promote nor advocate for it. The city is by state statute limited to just provide information, meaning the tax will generate this. The tax would have no sunset. It cannot say it's good or bad. And in some instances, some communities have identified potential projects so people know where the money will be spent.
Correct. So currently, tax increases are tough. Doesn't matter what they're for. Everybody here has voted on tax increases one way or the other. They're difficult. Is there a group currently willing to take the reins to advocate for this tax increase if it does get on the ballot? Do we know of a group out there that would, not campaign on behalf of the residents of this measure? I mean, they would have to raise money. It's a challenge. Is there somebody out there willing to take that on right now?
In the parks, the action plan for Parks and Recreation, that group of volunteers, they identified themselves as potential advocates for the tax. They knew the situation that the city was in and that it can't promote or advocate. And so a group of them said, when the time comes, we would be ready. Mr. Bartoni, I actually think there's a group out there that I'd like to investigate with the permission of the committee, and that's the Gateway Off-Road Cyclist. The relationship the city has with them is very positive. They are beneficiaries of the foresightedness of this committee in many regards when leasing the Rock Hollow Valley and Bluffview Park. Those two areas have become just magnets for off-road cyclists, hikers and bikers, and they have a great network. And I would like to approach them and see if they would be one group that could advocate for this tax with their membership.
Yeah, I think I know who you're alluding to there, and I would agree that would be, a potential advocate. The last time that this was on a ballot, Joe, was there a group out there that put this on behalf of everybody? Do you remember?
Yes, the group that had been involved in the incorporation advocated for the tax and attended many of our events that year, had different informational items prepared and handed it out. After a failed vote, you always look back and wonder what you could have done better. We had been given advice by good sources that if you have more people at a vote, generally parks issues are approved. So we went with the November 2008 election, the national election, a presidential election. And as I said, we got 20,000 voters, which is a lot. We were also, I believe, the seventh sales tax proposal on the list on that ballot. There were 6 others before us. And I assume by the time they got to the 7th one, regardless if it was good, bad, or indifferent, people were tired.
Yeah, it'd be hard to press yes 7 times on anything.
Yes.
So, and bear with me, and I'll kind of lead to where I'm going with this. The difference between Wildwood and Creve Coeur and Chesterfield and some of these other municipalities that have had success is we're a little bit more of a bedroom community than they are. Creve Coeur's probably got, 250,000 cars go between 270 and Olive every day. Thank God we don't have that. And I don't know how many people from around the area are driving to Wildwood to shop. So do we know, are we able to find out, maybe, this could be some takeaway, is the percent of the sales, like within town center, do we know what percent of those sales at the retail level are Wildwood residents versus non-Wildwood residents? Is that able to be calculated?
Sorry,
Your
my
motion,
light,
yeah.
my lights just went off. My apologies. I don't, but I will ask Mr. Jacquin to provide that information, and then we can email it out to all of you. All the calculation that has been asked for in past discussions has always been how much. And Mr. Cross, I believe, calculated that amount at just over $1 million, 1.2 million.
Would be the amount raised for the increase.
Yes, per year.
Right. And I'm just kind of curious as to what percent of the sales are, because where I'm going is like you look at Chesterfield, and Chesterfield, I've shopped in Chesterfield. Everybody probably here has shopped in Chesterfield, and my fear is with this sales tax increase for Wildwood is you're going to get the majority of the people paying this, so to speak, are not only going to be Wildwood residents, but they're going to be certain Wildwood residents. The Ward 8 residents, and Dan's group over, in Ward 7, the Lake Chesterfield area, and where Deborah's at, Ward 5. I mean, those residents shop in Wildwood, but you're looking at the residents in Wild Horse Creek down off of, down, closer to Chesterfield. How many of them are driving to town center to grocery shop when there's a lot of stores in Chesterfield that are much closer to their house? And my fear is that they will, you could get some residents like, yeah, I'll vote for this because I don't shop there. And you're going to get these market freeloaders out there that are going to get the benefits without ever having to pay for it. So that being where I'm kind of going with this was the sales tax, was that the only tax increase that was looked at? Because if the city would do something like a utility tax, every house in Wildwood is then paying for that. And I don't know if the parameters are the same with the utility tax as a sales tax. I haven't done that homework. And if you have to get the utility company's permission or how that works, or how much of that increase it would have to be to raise the $1.2 million that Mr. Cross is referring to. But, I want to make sure it's fair for everybody. And we don't have all those that retail that other municipalities have to track where people, paying for it, a certain percentage of Wildwood residents paying for it for the benefit of everybody in Wildwood and everybody else in, the area. So, you got people down 109 might be shopping in Eureka. People in my ward are shopping in Chesterfield and Ellisville, so I think that that's going to be a legitimate, concern to have out there. So I would ask them to also look to see if there's that a utility tax or something a little bit more equitable is an option also.
We certainly can do that. And I know at the end of the Economic Development Committee meeting tonight, there was a discussion on that point as well. I will tell you that when the city incorporated, one of the first ballot issues in April of 1996 was the reestablishment of the gross receipts tax, which is on utilities. And so, no, you do not need utility permission. The only dark cloud on that horizon, Councilmember Bartoni, is, and Mr. Cross can speak to this better than I, a lot of our gross receipts tax revenues from different utilities are declining, not increasing.
Okay, well, and that's something to, for all of us to keep in mind also. And I had one more thought, but it just kind of escaped me here. But if I think of it, I'll come back. But thanks for your time, Joe.
No, thank you for the suggestion. And again, Mr. Cross, did I say that incorrectly?
No, you are absolutely correct. Those revenues are in fact declining, so that and there's a trend there, so they're not going up. So don't know if that would be a viable option or not.
Sure. And the other, I just did remember my last comment that I wanted to make is, the all of the businesses, in Wildwood and throughout the community and throughout the country have had a rough year, and a lot of these businesses are requiring on government loans just to keep the doors open. I don't know how they would necessarily feel either. I don't know if the Economic Development Committee has gotten input from the local businesses, but I would hate to put them at a competitive disadvantage with the surrounding municipalities with a tax increase. And they're having tough times now, and I wouldn't want, us, Wildwood, to make it even more difficult for them.
Well, as we delve into this a little bit more, Councilmember Bartoni, what I can assure you is that we can do that comparison relative to Eureka, Chesterfield, Clarkson Valley, Baldwin, Manchester, et cetera, and show how our sales tax currently compares and what would our sales tax be with a half-cent addition, and then compare it. Right now, Wildwood has one of the lowest sales tax rates in all of St. Louis County. It's very close to that of the unincorporated county, quite frankly. So I'm hopeful that when we do that analysis, more West County specific instead of the large table, you'll see that, and hopefully it'll bear out what I've said and alleviate some of your fears.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Mr. Garantano?
Sure. I've got a couple of thoughts. I jotted down, so let me run through them. So first, the map that you showed where the tax is levied there, very helpful map. It does, that provides, I think, a positive message that we are really the outlier right now, and most of the municipalities throughout the county have some sort of tax. Couple of other points that I want to bring up is the annual expected revenue with the tax. I believe it's 1.1 million. And this is a tax that would be shared or split with Watershed Erosion. So it kind of goes to my point of that we probably need to get a good accounting of what that means, because our residents will expect that of us. And that's probably a question we will get, is where does this money go? And why do you need this money, right? It's like, a kid going to their parent saying, hey, I need money. Why do you need the money? What are you going to do with it? And we need those answers. So we would have to have those answers to our taxpayers as far as what do we plan to do and why do you need it now? And especially in a period of time like that right now where there are some constraints, that question's more likely to come up. Also, in a similar note relating to the share with Watershed Erosion, and the same question really is for the Watershed Erosion, right? How are you going to spend the money? Because, and I've shared this sentiment with Councilmember Remy, that I think Watershed Erosion is going to have to set their focus on a realistic plan, one that could be achieved within a few years, and not, if we were to look at that $19 to $30 million number that was mentioned by Councilmember Remy, to me, that's a number that we won't even be around when that project's complete. If you split this tax just 50-50, that's $500,000 a year. To get to 20 million is what, 40 years or so? So that plan, if it really wants to have success, they need to prioritize what are the top 5 projects and really focus on that. And there could be multiple phases, but I think that's where you're going to get wins out of it. I do have a question. I don't know that there's an answer, but it's probably something that needs to be considered. If this tax were to proceed as a ballot item, because we're sharing it with the Watershed Erosion, my concern is that we also have a law on the books that says that whenever we have a project over $3.5 million, that requires voter approval. So we're not actually going to the voters once, we're going to them twice. And I think that might, I don't know, but Joe, you might think about that, because that's going to be confusing to voters. So we do need to think through that scenario there. Sorry for the noise here. So anyway, let's see, Watershed Erosion. So that's my point there, Watershed Erosion. The internet is something that is still important. In fact, it was one of the top prioritized items. We have to realize that that ask is going to be coming to the council soon. And I don't want to forget that, because that's been an effort that's been going on for years, a lot of time and money invested in it. And those folks are going to be asking for some kind of funding. So that is going to be a competing priority. Don brought up the point around businesses, what's the business impact? So I'm not going to repeat that comment. I think that's a question, it could potentially be a question from the businesses. Why are you doing this? And Don also brought up the point of, maybe who bears the brunt of that added tax there. So I think it is fair to make sure we're looking at all the options, right? We don't want to jump to conclusion or jump to something right away. I did have another point around timing, but given that we did see Creve Corps vote and pass the item, maybe my timing concern isn't as valid. I thought with COVID and everything going on that a tax in the middle of a season like this would be even a harder sell, but I don't know, Creve Corps passed it in November, so maybe that's not so much important. So those are my comments there. So Joe, to your point, you're looking for maybe some direction or some feedback on this. My biggest ask would just be, really, I think it would be good to see the accounting. Where do you project that the money would go? Is it just to current maintenance? Is it to do, questions might be about, are you doing new stuff with it? Things like that. And then, of course, how that split happens in theory with the watershed erosion. And hopefully they will narrow their focus and prioritize to some projects where they can get some wins. Because I think, kind of doing the big pick, the whole system is like trying to accomplish a project of trying to boil the ocean. So those are my comments.
Thank you.
Mr. Rambo?
Tracy's been waving her hand for a while. I'll let her go if she, did you want to speak, Tracy?
Yeah, I just had a general comment on something to think about for the future. If we're talking about November, I didn't know if Rockwood has any plans to have anything on the ballot, Metro West, anyone else that we would be competing with monetarily, as well as turnout. Because we know bond issues bring a large turnout. Does that work to our advantage or disadvantage? Whatever. I mean, just things to think about. What else will be on the ballot?
Thank you.
Katie?
Just real quickly, I wanted to kind of sum up, I think what we need to do based on everybody's comments is, first, we need to identify and engage some advocacy groups outside of us, because we as citizen representatives can't push it as a council member. We can push it on our own personal sides. We need to clearly identify the percentage that's going to go to parks, the percentage that's going to go to watershed erosion, and the percentage that's going to go to any other city improvements like the rural internet or will it. That has to be spelled out for the residents in order for them to know where their money's going. Then we need to develop the longer term list of the specific projects in each of those different categories, at least over the next 5 years, so that people know what they're buying with their tax dollars. And so I don't know if part of that needs to come out of our committee to help identify those things from the parks side, and then out of the watershed committee for here's some specific tangible things that we're going to do with your funds so that they know what they're paying for. And then we need to figure out how we can share those specific pieces of information with the public from a legal standpoint, and then what information we can turn over to an advocacy group so that they can go out and better sell it. I think where we lost on the last parks issue was there wasn't as effective of a communication plan put in place to really tell the residents what, yeah, parks, that's a big nebulous term. What does that mean for me as a resident? And so I think we need to get a little down in the weeds on some of this stuff so that we can clearly identify for our residents how the city council and these committees are going to move forward with their tax dollars to make their city better.
Thank you, ma'am.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks. I can say that the REAC was considering utility tax, just sort of on the grounds that internet could be considered a utility. And to Mr. Bartoni's point about residents not shopping in Wildwood, the Economic Development Committee is probably the right place to talk about this, but I think we could do a better job informing folks, trying to get the Wild Horse people to shop in Wildwood and those kinds of things, and maybe an uphill climb, but I don't know if we're going to be able to do anything about that. So my main question, Katie sort of answered it about can council members help sell this? And the answer, I guess, is we're citizens and we don't give up our rights when we become council members, but we have to be careful to keep the two separate. And so I'm happy to participate any way that I can to sell this, particularly on the park side, which kind of brings me to my real point, which is there are a lot of moving parts here. We've got to fund watershed work, which may be a little bit longer term down the road. We're wanting to fund, the parks, and we've got several things, and a couple of different ways we can try to fund them. And if we need to pay for the internet project, which has become pretty clear and a pretty short-term ask, and we also want to fund parks forever, and we want to fund watershed work virtually forever, there has to be some central place for us to do this planning and say, okay, this we can ask for half-cent sales tax increase on the November ballot, and it's going to be for X and Y, and then we'll have to ask for a utilities tax either before or after, and it's going to be for Z, because there are different time frames associated with those big three. I would throw deer management potentially in there and some other high dollar items, and I don't think we can do this on a committee level, and I don't know if a full council session is the place to talk about it either. So I'm looking for, I guess I'm asking Steve and Joe their thoughts on that, how to get this together and hash it out sort of as in a holistic way.
Steve or Joe, would you like to comment?
Well, with the permission of Mr. Cross, the process in 2008 was much simpler, Councilmember Rambo. We didn't kind of clutter the closet with the stormwater stuff. We were focusing just on parks and trails. Now we have that other partner that we need to do. And I actually think presenting questions like tonight to the committee and getting your responses and getting direction on where we need to investigate things will get us to a point where I do believe we'll need some kind of work session at City Council to talk through, here's what the committee's identified, here's what our strategic planning goals say, here's what the two committees have identified, and here's the information that we've developed to date. And I just think it's an iterative process. It may not be perfect, but it's going to take a bit of time, but I think we can get there. We got there in 2008. It was a little simpler, but at the end of the day, we had a solid ballot measure. And I still emphasize that over 9,000 residents did support it. That's a good number, but not enough.
Okay, so time is of the essence on at least one of these things, which is internet. And we have the REAC, we have the economic development folks, we have this committee here. There are a lot of folks talking about how to get money, the stormwater, the WETF. So that's 4 groups right there. I don't think we have time to, we don't have any time to waste. But if you think running it through the committees is the best way to do it, and then would you, Joe and Steve, pull that together into some document that we have to review and have a work session item at some not too distant future date? Is that the way that's going to work then?
Mr. Rambo, kind of along those lines, yes. Kind of to leverage what Mr. Vunich just said, and what we've been talking about this evening is there are a number of competing entities for dollars. But at the end of the day, you all have noticed that the mayor is quite adamant of having these discussions at a work session with the full council. The committee, this committee, as well as WETF, can do some of the heavy lifting in terms of trying to identify what their priorities are to try to get it down to a manageable number, dollar amount of what they're looking for. But, you know, again, the mayor, as you know, we have 8 priorities, and watershed erosion is number 3. Internet is number 1. And that was basically 16 council members determining that. And we still have the sub goals to do, which will be on the work session at 2 weeks hence. But at the end of the day, the mayor is going to want to drive this, and that's why he's been reluctant to have this come up at council when we didn't have adequate time to talk about it, or that he wasn't there, as was the case last night. So it'll be back on. But ultimately, the discussion of where we're going to go in terms of getting dollars. So if we're talking rural internet, and that's a $7 to $10 million price tag, where those monies are going to come from, and then this parks and stormwater tax, and there are limitations in terms of what those dollars can be spent on, and there's other types of taxes that was brought up earlier that these kinds of expenditures wouldn't qualify under. But at the end of the day, Joe and I can pull some information together from the council and put it together. But ultimately, we're going to have to make a presentation to council in a work session, and the mayor is going to have a lot of input in terms of where he sees this going. I can assure you of that.
Don?
Okay, fair enough. The react, people are dying. We have to act. And so I'm sort of trying to foreshorten the process. I don't want building the perfect beast to get in the way of providing internet service for folks that don't have it. That's all. So thanks for your time, guys.
Well, again, rural internet's priority 1.
Don?
Thanks, Deborah. So first a comment, Joe, you've referenced the 9,000 residents. In November, we're not going to have a federal election. I don't think there's any significant state one. If you get 9,000 votes, I think you won by a landslide. So
Thank you.
yeah. But that being said, yeah. That being said, and I did see the comment, Kathy, thanks for responding. The last thing we would need is tomorrow morning to have in the front line of the papers that Wildwood's looking at a property tax. Like, we are not doing that. So I'm glad that got squashed quick. But another committee that I didn't know if it would be appropriate, and I don't know if, Steve or who's the correct person to ask this committee, but with the Community Outreach Committee that was recently formed, is this something that they would want to take on also? And is this something that we could get some help from them on? So just more of a question.
I think Kathy may want to opine on that. There's a meeting of the COTF coming up fairly soon, but they've recognized, and Kathy, you can speak to this, but I think they're trying to really kind of find their way in terms of what that committee really is trying to do. And Mr. Flasher is the co-chair of that committee. I'm not sure, and I'll let those two folks talk, but I'm not sure that this is something that would fall under that committee. But Kathy and Dan, you guys can talk.
Well, I think the challenge is the timing of it. I think you're right. Councilmember Flasher can speak to this too, but that committee is trying to get their feet under them and establish relationships with not-for-profits in the area and provide that information to residents so they know what services and organizations are available in the area, regardless of what their need is per se. We've kind of discussed a plan that kind of ends, brings that committee to a close near the end of this year. But if a committee, they would have to disband prior to taking any action in promotion of the tax. They couldn't, as a city committee, promote or advocate. So they're just getting started, and I think to end them and make them this advocate may not be the direction they're seeking. But Councilman Fleischer.
Yeah, I just agree with everything that Kathy just said. I don't really have anything to add outside of that. Thank you.
Katie?
I was just going to make sure that everybody understood that particular committee is not meant to do any fundraising for the city at all. It's more of a communication resource for the various services and not-for-profits throughout the community and the region. So until that committee, I'm a member on it, gets its 4 legs on the ground as to where it's headed, I don't think even bringing up the thought of them helping support any kind of tax increase.
Teresa?
I just had a question, a general question. I know that our plan here is to keep the top priorities as the top priorities. And that would be our #1 criteria for determining where this money went. But after we decided which of these top priorities needed this money, what are our criteria for prioritizing those that we've chosen? How do we determine which one is going to get the most, or where the money's going to go? If we were to do the tax and we had the full amount that we're talking about, how do we determine by criteria and not just, this is what I want. I want to put most of it in the project I'm working on. Instead of that, how do we determine?
Well, Mr. Cross mentioned that one of the principal tools for making determinations like you've described, Ms. Clark, and that's the council strategic planning process that covers a 5-year window. Supporting that as well is the 5-year capital improvements plan, which is updated as part of the budgeting process at the end of each fiscal year. That window also goes out, as I said, 5 years. And then more immediately, we use the capital improvements budget each fiscal year to make determinations for that year. So those are the 3 principal documents or guiding principles that help us allocate funds. And not to say that they're inflexible, there is flexibility, but we try to stay with those each time we bring a project to City Council.
And I would add, I would add to what Mr. Vunich just talked about in that, and I would think that most of you would agree that the strategic planning process that we are going through now is one of the best strategic planning processes that the city has undertaken. It has been more intentional, more focused, more collaborative than we've ever had before. And for that, the mayor should be congratulated in terms of how he's driving this process. But that will be the Bible or the living document, if you will, going forward. And we will use that as a guide. We'll develop the 5-year, but then we will measure each year to that 5-year Doesn't mean that nothing can change. You all have the power to change priorities based on what happens, what's going on at that time. But once we get these sub goals in place, and we're not gonna identify 40 sub goals underneath public works or anything like that. We'll concentrate on the top 3 or 5 within each category, because that's about all we'll be able to address in the next 5 years if we do our job right. But once we get that set, that's kind of our roadmap going forward, by which each one of these projects will be measured.
Any other council member like to make a comment?
And Madam Chair, just one last clarifying remark, if you would allow. The Parks and Stormwater sales tax cannot be spent on economic development, cannot be spent on rural internet. State statute limits it to parks and stormwater. So the problem you as council and we as city staff face is there are a number of projects that need different funding streams, and they all are based on taxes or collection of taxes we already have.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich, for pointing that out. I think everybody made a lot of good comments. One thing I would ask that the staff look into is what the state is doing and what progress they have made and what progress they think they will make on being able to collect taxes on internet sales. I think that would have some good information before we go ahead and decide what we intend on doing with the tax that we collect. And I think it's really important. I'm not saying that internet shouldn't be funded or any other projects shouldn't be funded, but I think Mr. Bunich's comment about if you're going to call it stormwater and parks tax, that's what the funding has to be used for. So if we're going to use it for multiple projects, then we need to come up with an appropriate title for our tax. The other thing that I would like to know is how did Creve Coeur go about passing their tax? What approach did they take? What information did they put forward? What groups did they use to promote that? So those are 2 requests that I have. And I'm not sure if Robert, Don put up their hand first.
I didn't mean to put mine up.
Okay, so that leaves Mr. Rambo.
Okay, so it sounds as though at least Mr. Vunich is tentatively convinced that this is going to be a parks and stormwater combo tax. And that brings me back around to my initial concern. I don't want the parks to get lost in the shuffle. And so I would suggest, to the extent possible, we sort of leave it open until we figure out how much money we can get from a utility tax, how much we're actually going to need for the WETF, how much we can use for REAC, and how we're going to pay for that. And then I just, maybe it's a sales tax for parks and leave it at that. And then the next year we ask for the internet because everybody will support it, or vice versa. I think actually I said that wrong, because I think internet, if we could shorten it 2 days. I had an irate 30-minute call today about internet, and it happens all the time. So I don't know. It sounds as though probably Mr. Cross is going to be putting some things together and bringing them forward to the council as a whole. I'd suggest that it would be getting the cart before the horse if we start calling the sales tax by a particular name at this point. That's all I had.
I think, and Mr. Vunich may correct me if I'm wrong, but and it may be a state statute, but calling it a parks and stormwater tax, that is a specific term by state statute.
Okay.
So we can't change that name. That is in fact what it is. And that's the only thing that those dollars can go for is parks and stormwater, as Mr. Vunich pointed out.
So it didn't come from y'all. It's just, that's the way it's written. And so that's the way we need to speak about it.
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
Garantano?
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate, I think it's going to be key to know the data that is being presented in order to make a decision. But something too that I've mentioned a lot over at the Watershed Erosion Task Force, and I'm saying this for the benefit of folks that are not part of the that group there, is that if such an approach is taken, there needs to be, and I know there was talk here at the meeting regarding potentially an advocacy group, which, as was stated, that is not something that can be done by the city and falls under the definition of an action committee. But the, even from a educational perspective, that is something that the city can do on any particular ballot item. Educational is fine as long as it's not advocating for or against. But whatever decision is made, I anticipate that you have to expect that it's going to take a good number of months to get the message across. Putting one post on social media is not the answer. You have to put communications and messaging 7 times, at least 7 different ways. And, and that takes time. It's basically advertising. So that's important to know. And, just as you see, and I mentioned this too at the last Watershed Erosion meeting, most recently over the city of Eureka, they had a proposition there on the ballot for their water system. But there was also an opposition group out there trying to counter the message. So I would not rule that out too, because the tax is sometimes not well received. Just the word tax can be scary to people. So that's the thing. You have to, how do you have a good solid case behind this? So that's all.
Any other comments? So Mr. Bunich and Mr. Cross, do you have the information that you need?
We have a starting point and we appreciate the input very much.
Best of luck, guys.
Our next action item is prioritization of the 2021 Parks and Trails projects awards. Mr. Bunich.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and members of the committee, the Department of Planning recognizes the budget constraints that affect fiscal year 2021. And reflecting that, I'm sure you recognize that the capital improvements plan for 2021 contains very little in terms of certain park, trail, and other recreation activities in terms of projects. However, there are several smaller projects the department would like to investigate this year. They may not be projects that ultimately end with construction or installation, but would like to start laying the groundwork, so to speak, in terms of landscaping at a couple of the parks in the city, specifically as identified Old Pond School Park and Anniversary Park. At Old Pond School Park, we've had several of the larger evergreen trees die. We've not replaced them, but certainly they could need to be replaced. We also have a number of evergreen trees that have been impacted by the deer population. And so there's an opportunity there, I think, to kind of address it. Also, there's just, as I say, some bridge maintenance things that need to be done in Rock Hollow, some work down in Cone Park to address an ongoing drainage issue. So these are not what I would consider major projects that are typically accustomed to seeing presented by the department, but these are smaller maintenance type projects to kind of ensure that the parks continue to function safe and look aesthetically pleasing. So tonight I was hoping to present this list to you, receive authorization to start looking at the cost associated with them, and then return with those cost numbers so as that we can make decisions about available funds and direction to head. So tonight, again, I'm seeking the authorization to begin the preliminary work on these to see what the cost will be to the city. Thank you.
Katie?
I'll make a motion that Joe move forward to give us more detailed information on costs, time frame for the 7 priorities he has listed on his memo here.
Mr. Bartoni seconded the motion. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstain? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Our next action item is reimagining the spring egg hunt due to the ongoing pandemic awards. Mr. Mooney, or is this Kathy?
Actually, it'll be myself. So thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and members of the committee, it is with a little bit of disappointment that I state that I don't think we'll be ready for in-person events by March of this year. Despite the vaccine being available, obviously there's been some glitches in its distribution and getting it to the people that need it. And certainly our spring egg hunt brings over 1,000 people to a small area, typically old Fairway Elementary School in the enclaves at Cherry Hills. And so as department staff, we sat down and tried to reimagine how we could do a spring egg hunt, not wanting to cancel it for the second year in a row. And the idea is that we will do a drive-through event and that the provider of the eggs can package them in smaller bags of 15. Will be available here at City Hall for our residents to drive up. The number of children they have, they'll receive that same number of bags. And along with that, we'll give them a list of locations that we think would be great for egg hunts, such as Community Park, Babbler State Park, et cetera, et cetera. Along with that, we're hoping to have some signs out there that just kind of are spring-like, Easter-like, so to speak. Have the fire department here with their large hook and ladder displaying the American flag, and then have some clowns that just help us pass the time as people wait in line to pick up their eggs and additional items. And so tonight we're presenting the concept to you. We've not taken this public yet, and we want to get your feedback. And then also, if you have any other suggestions that might make a drive-through egg event something that's a little unusual, but enjoyable for our residents. So again, we're just seeking some direction and any thoughts you might have. Thank you.
Steve?
What Joe didn't mention, and if this may tip the scales, but Joe will be wearing an 8-foot bunny outfit at that distribution. So if you want to see that, vote for this idea because it's a great. He's too modest to mention that he's going to play the Easter bunny.
I have you, Teresa.
I'd like to see him wear. How about the pink bunny from A Christmas Story? So, Joe, I think this is a fantastic idea. You and your team continue to come up with these wonderful suggestions and ideas to somehow engage our residents at a time that it's very difficult to engage. So I know a lot of places did like a drive-through visit with Santa that was very successful, and some people I know have young kids said that it worked, and I think this is a great idea. I'll support this, and I'll make the motion for you guys to move forward with whatever you need to do to make this happen.
Dan, are you seconding the motion?
With the pink bunny outfit, include that in the motion.
And Teresa would like to make a comment.
Yes, I would. I also was reading on the list that the businesses are asked if they want to put something in the bag with the eggs, which I thought was a really good idea. And I just thought maybe the schools would want to put something in too, maybe a small coloring page or something that the child could color and bring back to the city hall to put up on a wall for a few days.
Thank you. Great suggestion.
Any other comments? I think it would be nice if you could add some music to the event.
Oh, yeah.
It's music.
Parents as teachers have done a lot of these drive-through activities, and they've been very, very successful. You might even want to get in touch with Rockwood's Early Childhood Department and see if they'd like to participate in some way. They could put a finger play sheet in there, or other activities and arts and crafts, along with something like the coloring page.
Thank
Any
you.
other
Good
comments?
suggestions.
So we have a motion on the floor. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I,
Any opposed? Any abstain? The motion passes.
Thank you.
We do have a closed session item this evening. So please use the update on the virtual recreation programs and the update report on the facility reservation as an information item. So then our next action item is our executive session. We need a roll call to go into executive session. Gary, would you